Everyone is welcome here, it's time to make new friends. Fill your Glencairn. Share a dram with the spirit of Edmonton.
Slancha, ladies and gentlemen, and hello to one and all here. Let's get that little banner off here so we can see my face just a little bit. Although maybe we don't want to see my face. Maybe. I'll just let my wife do it. And if it's up to her, you're not seeing my face. So, good day, Whiskey brothers, sisters, and friends. Welcome to the Whisky Book Club's fourth book of Season 5 with Pip Hills, the author of this book right here, Maverick, the Founder's Tale. And we're coming back. This is the second edition of this one right there. And as always, I'm honored to have you, the viewer, here with us today. There are other whiskey book clubs out there, but none of them that delve so deeply into the subject matter than we will hear today with the author, Pip. My name's Dolph. I'm the president of the Alberta Scotch Society. I'm a member of the SMWS. Maybe I shouldn't show you my number, but who cares? And president of the Alberta Scotch Society, founder of this Whisky Book Club guy. Really happy to be here. That's what this is. But really, what this also is a home base. It's a safe place for whiskey geeks like you and me who love to read about whiskey-related articles, books, anything that kind of flounders around with. Now, this book, I'll show it again, is the 25th book we've reviewed on the Whisky Book Club. It's also the latest of several books that Pip has authored, and we'll go over them in a minute. And Pip, he's a masterful storyteller. He is the founder, the number one. When he has his card, it's number one. And I'll show you the picture about that later. And here with us this morning, well, this evening for him, this morning for us in Alberta. Pip, welcome. And tell me, sir, what's in your glass today?
I've no idea.
Okay.
I long since lost track of what all the distillery numbers were.
If you tell me, Mr. Greg Perlinski will on the side tell you exactly what it is because he's memorized
it says it's number 11.48.
11.48.
What distillery number 11 was, I've long since forgotten.
Gregory's going to pull that up. I tell you, it'll come up in a second and we'll put it right there. And because I have faith, Gregory's my go-to guy with memory. And we'll see him and we'll see Rob Carpenter, co-founder of the Canadian SMWS in a little while. But we're going to talk to you for a little bit, Pip. How are you doing?
Sorry?
How are you doing? It sounds like you have a bit of a cold.
I'm doing not badly. I've been unwell for a few weeks.
Oh, sorry. To hear that.
It's when you get to my age and you fall sick, then inevitably what you think is this the thing that's going to kill me?
Is this the one?
Well, I'm 83 now. My father died when he was 70. My grandfather died when he was 40. So,
wow.
It stands to reason that if you get sick, you think. I mean, not morosely, but just with sort of kind of interest. I mean, one takes an interest in these things, and
Yes.
Given that we've all got to die, it makes sense to take an interest in just how it's going to happen. And I've come pretty close to dying on a number of occasions in my life.
The rock climbing one, if we remember closely, you fell, what was that, 30 or 50 meters you fell?
But so I'm naturally curious as to what it is that's going to kill me. So I'm pleased to say that what's causing me to cough at the moment is probably not going to kill me, or at least not for a few years. So I'm pretty cheery about it.
And just to go over, I think number 11 is Tomatin. if I'm looking it up properly. So you're having a tomatin, which I like very well. It's very, very meaty, the tomatin. So
Yeah. Well,
excellent dram.
this is nice stuff, I must say.
And mine, I should show it as well. That's what I have. And I'm going to thank Rob and Kelly Carpenter for that, because I've long since drank my 1-210. So Glenfarclas, of course, number one, the first barrel that you ever had. And I'm going as well. This is young. This is a 7-year-old, but I like young whiskeys as well. So, and Pip, you said that as well. You love the sprite.
Yes, sure. Man, there are there are far too many people value old whiskey, not because it's particularly nice, but because it's expensive.
Yeah.
I mean, you must know lots of clowns who spend huge amounts of money on very old whiskey, and they think there's something special because they like very old whiskey. And most very old whiskey, in my opinion, doesn't taste as nice as
some very young ones.
Sprightly, youngish whiskey.
I agree completely. And if you're going to pay the money for a 40, 45-year-old, and then it doesn't, I feel bad.
It may be nice at 40 or 45 years old, but the chances are it's not going to be. And I can tell you a story about that if you like.
You know what? Let's do that. Before I even get into that, you are a masterful storyteller, and we're giving you the floor. You want to tell a story? It's yours, Pip. And I'll drink whiskey as I listen to you, kind of.
Yeah. No, I can't remember if I put it in the book or not, but it was probably around about 1990 when the society was well established, but not hugely well known. And in those days, there was only one whiskey shop in England. In the whole of England, there was one whiskey shop. It was run by a guy called Jack Milroy in Greek Street in Soho, and it was known as Milroy's. And I just happened to be in London, and I happened to be in Soho, and I thought I'd go in and say hello. So I went in and said hi, and Jack was pleased to see me, and we talked about whiskey for a little bit. And he said, "Would you like a dram?" And I said, "Well, I have been known to take one now and then." And he said, "Let me get here." So he poured me something, and we drank it, and it was nice. I forget what it was. And then he said to me, "Here's something you might like to try." And he brought out a bottle without a label and poured some dark spirit. Okay. And he poured it into the glass and said, "Try that. Tell me how you like it." So I had a look at this, and I stuck my nose in. And it was interesting, and it was strange. And it was certainly woody. So I thought about it for a bit. And, when you're put in that kind of position, it's easy to make a fool of yourself. And the only way you can avoid making a fool of yourself is to be completely honest.
Okay.
And say what it's like.
Right.
So he said, "Well, what do you think?" And I said, "Well, it's old. I can see that it's old." I said, "I think it's a very, very good whiskey, and that it was probably a much better whiskey 20 years ago." How old is it?
Okay.
He said it's a Springbank, and it's 40 years old. And I said, "Yeah, I think that this was a really beautiful whiskey 20 years ago, but it's not beautiful whiskey now." And he said, "Yeah," he said, I know what you mean. It's over the hill." But he says, "The Japanese pay me £200 a bottle for it." Now, this was in 1990, which was unknown in the Orientals, it seems to me, tend to pay big money for very old spirit. Now, I think there's a big social status thing goes on in especially in the Far East, in Japan and China and Korea and places like that. It's a big status number, and they buy into the idea that because it's more expensive if it's older, it must be better. Now, you know as well as I do, one of the things that we established in the society right at the beginning is that what people taste is to a large extent determined by their expectations.
Yes.
And I mean, you will by and large taste what you expect to taste. So if you're an elderly Japanese and you drink this old whiskey and you paid big bucks for it,
you're going to love it.
And you expect it to taste wonderful, there's a good chance it will taste pretty good.
Yeah.
But purely objectively, by and large, I don't think it's worth the money.
Well, and you tried it blind, and great, and you had your opinion of it, which was great. And I hope he respected you for the opinion.
Well, you know, I've had that situation a number of times of being in a position where you could easily make a fool of yourself because you say the sort of things you think people want you to say.
Yeah.
But I've never exactly been famous for saying the things that people want me to say. It's a lot more fun to tell the truth.
I agree. And you can't be faulted. You're just being honest, and it's great. And well,
and of course you have the pleasure of being honest when you might have, had the displeasure of telling a lie.
And you don't have to remember.
In a sense, its own reward where whiskey's concerned.
You don't have to remember the lie, and sometimes it makes you look it makes you look more honest, not obviously honest, but more down home, more.
Absolutely. Look, life is short. Why should we spend it demeaning ourselves by saying things that we think other folk might approve of?
I'm going to love that quote. I might make a quote out of it and put it on the side with my other quote as well. I'm going to get to the book, though, because not even to the book. It's prior to the book. So, Pip, it's been just over 2 years that we spent our 3-part whiskey book club together on the Founder's Tale, the original one right here. And my wife was a bit disappointed in the new cover because she missed this. She liked the caricature. So, and the caricature wasn't in the new book, and she didn't like that as much. So she was kind of hoping that maybe the new book would have had this caricature maybe on the corner or the side. But again, we spent roughly 6.25 hours together over those 3 weeks. And this educational, interesting, entertaining time was witnessed by just over 1,000 people on Facebook and YouTube Live. And it's there forever. They're going to see you for years and years. Long after I'm gone, it's still going to be there in the ether for them to see what you thought about this book, which I love. But what I want is to know what you've been doing. What's been your focus over these past 2 years? Because it's been 2 years and 3 months since we talked. Well, no, we've talked online several times, but since we talked online with this book.
Yeah, well, I've not been focused on anything very much. And let's face it, during these 2 or 3 years, we've all been afflicted by COVID, and we've been keeping our heads down and treating it with good malt whiskey and so on. What has happened over these 2 or 3 years is that, as you know, I came back into the fold of the Whisky Society.
Yes.
About 5 years ago. And I've been trying to make sure that I'm not being a nuisance. And I've been trying to sort of dodge people who want to treat me as a celebrity, because that's no fun at all. So, I've just been kind of feeling my way. And a bit over a year ago, Rebecca, who was then our marketing director, came to me and said, look, it's going to be 40 years next year since the society was founded. And we reckon we'll make a big thing about it. And I said, well, fine, no problem to me. And so they set up various junketings to do with the 40th anniversary. And she said, look, we thought we might, we might have a special edition of the Founder's Tale. And I said, that's fine. And she said, how would you feel about writing about what it was like to come back to the society? So I said, yeah, that's okay. That's no trouble at all. I'm once again, in the simple spirit of telling the truth, there's no problem. You just tell it like it happened. And so I wrote the chapter about what it was like coming back. And that's quite an interesting story in itself.
In from the cold.
In from the cold, yeah. I mean, I'm plagiarizing John le Carre, of course.
That's
spy
right.
In from the cold. So that took up most of last year, and I had to sort of traipse around and go and talk to people and drink drams with them, which was not onerous, I must say.
They didn't run you off your feet, I'm guessing, because sometimes when, let's say, a national, international brand ambassador comes to Western Canada, they have a 10-day sprint through all the provinces and all the stores. They took it easy on you, though, Pip, right? It was enjoyable.
Well, we did. They did ask me if I would go to a number of events in the United States. Mm-hmm. I had suggested that we come to Canada as well, and there were some people who wanted us to go to Mexico, but it was all organized by the company, and
right.
I just went along. And as it turned out, we went to New York and Washington D.C. and San Francisco.
The three.
Now, okay. I like New York and I like San Francisco of old, but I'd never been in Washington D.C.
Okay.
It's impressive, there is no doubt, but it's not the kind of place you'd want to live in. Although they set up an astonishing gig with a large number of society members. Nice. And of course, I had to go around and drink drams with them all and tell them stories. And they were most affable. And I had a lovely time. There's no question about that. And,
good.
They seem to. I got the impression that quite a number of them thought that the story about the society was partly bullshit, and that it was just a corporation that had made up this story. But so I was happy to turn them up, and I think I probably convinced them that it wasn't. Well, anyway, I had a nice time doing that, and I've been doing various things. I don't have a big project on at the moment, which is unusual for me, because throughout most of my life, I have had a major project of one kind or another. Mind you, being 83, staying alive is a big sort of project.
It's a very good. Well, self-preservation is always quite important, I think, is what we should be doing. But you have done tons, because you've written this book and you've written this book, not in that time, but these are all large projects devoted to all of these books. So that takes a long time. And about 5 years ago, they brought you in to do this. So that was the 35th anniversary, where you were correct. That was 35th, where they re-released the very first 1.1. I wish I was there at the vaults with you. It would have been fantastic.
I look like a death's head in that one.
Really?
Anyway, who cares?
It's a good picture. I do like this one better.
That one's a bit better.
I like that one better. But this is still a good picture, Pip. I'd be happy with
anyway, what I was going to say was they decided to bottle a bottle of 40-year-old whiskey to mark the 40th anniversary, which got sold at an absurdly high price, because not because they were profiteering, but simply because they had to pay a hell of a lot of money to get this.
Yeah.
So I had to drink it and talk about it.
Okay.
And I said, well, I warn you, I'm not going to say it's nice if it's not.
And if I thought it would be better 20 years ago, I'm going to say that too.
I said, as you know, I don't like old whiskey particularly, but I must say it's a honey. It really is very, very good stuff. So I didn't have a problem with that.
I'm going to ask you about this one, though. Did you have a hand in picking this? So,
yeah, I have to say that the Maverick idea was Rebecca's. It wasn't mine.
Okay.
And I think what she wanted to do was to get over the notion of how unorthodox the whole thing was when we started the society.
All right.
Because practically everything that the whiskey industry does now is copied from what we started in 1983.
And we're going to talk about various elements of that as well. But yes, I agree completely.
Yeah. And Rebecca was trying to get over the idea that what we did then was a very Maverick sort of thing to do. So I wasn't sure that I liked the term Maverick because it was the title of a very kind of Western soap opera of about 30 years ago. I don't know if you remember that on television.
I think so. It was more than 30 years.
It was a story about a family of people who wore big hats and rode horses in Texas, and it was pretty boring. But I went along with it because people understand the meaning of the term. But I did what nobody I knew had done. That's to say, I went and looked up the origin of the term. And the origin of the term is interesting. And I wrote a little article for the newsletter about it.
Okay. So what is the etymology of Maverick, please?
Samuel Maverick was a kind of high-grade hustler who, probably of Irish origin in the Carolinas, decided in, I think, about 1830s, 1840s, thereabouts, to go west and seek his fortune. And he ended up in Texas. He got involved in the war against Mexico. He got put in jail at some point. And he also became mayor of the local town. But he became a big-scale rancher. And now, the ranches in Texas didn't have fences because they were too big. I mean, some of them are as big as a decent country. And the problem was, how do you know whose cattle are whose?
Yes.
And what they did was they branded them, like you see on the cowboy films.
Yeah.
Now, Maverick took a principled stand as an important rancher. He said, I won't brand my cattle. It's cruel to the cattle, and so on. Now, his reason, of course, was nothing to do with that. The reason he didn't want to brand cattle was he could then go and round up any cattle that didn't have brands on them
and call them his.
Yep. And he was a free spirit and lay rather loose with the law. And I think he was probably an interesting guy. But this is the origin of the term.
And you identified with that a little bit, so you thought, sure, I like it all. Why not?
Because when we started the society, people in the industry said, look, the industry is going to come down on you like a ton of bricks. You're going to find yourself with legal actions for passing off. If you use the name of a distillery, because they're all registered trademarks, which is one of the reasons why we've got the numbering system for bottling. And why number one is Glenfarclas, because that's the one we started with.
That one right there. I'll show the bottle again. Maybe people didn't see that little number 1.
That's the 210th Cask Society
Yes,
bottle from Glenfarclas.
and a lovely one. Thank you very much, Mr. Carpenter in the side. He'll show up later. Pip, I still want a little background story. Not story. Clarification, if we may. So I have a little chicken and the egg conversation or question for you. Were you brought back into the SMWS fold because you wrote the Founder's Tale? Or did you write the Founder's Tale after being approached to come back to the SMWS family? So which one came first, please?
Oh, very much after.
Okay.
Now, when they approached me and asked me to come back, it was kind of open-ended.
Okay.
And, they said, just come. I said, what do you expect me to do? And they said, well, pretty well what you please, which is still the case these days. So it's not a bad billet. And when I need some whiskey, I just phone Richard up and say, Richard, I need some whiskey. And they send me some whiskey.
He seems like a lovely man, and you pay tribute to him in the chapter.
He's a really good guy.
Nice.
Okay. A good friend of mine. He's coming to visit me in a couple of weeks.
Nice. Okay. Well, and we invited him to come on today, but he was busy, which is fine, which is good. But you do talk about him in your 2 new chapters. Well, they're not new chapters. They're part of the epilogue, I think is what we called it. Or no, postscript. He's part of these 2 chapters are part of the postscript. So coming in from the cold, and then the second one, kilts, tartans, and whiskey. And let's talk about other books as well. So Pip, since our last meeting, I've made an effort to find the other books that we talked about. So when you wrote, and let's throw up I like my quotes. Okay, so right here there we go. With the help of the Scotch Whisky Research Institute and some leading experts, I devised a scheme for a perfectly objective and comprehensive way of analyzing and exhibiting the various flavors of which a whiskey was capable. After a year in a shack above Granton Harbor with 300 bottles of whiskey and lots of visitors, this resulted in a book about which I've written elsewhere. It didn't make me a lot of money, but my friends liked it, and it won me the approval in places I cared about. Now, what I thought this was previously was appreciating whiskey. I thought that came from this book, but it did not, Pip. You told me that it came from that one.
Scotch Whiskey Directory, yes.
Yeah. And I should have remembered this, Pip, because in our 3rd interview, 2 years ago, November, we talked about this quite a bit. We had a lot of the discussions about how you had the 4 blind samples. You gave the 4 blind samples to 4 very well-respected individuals, and they came up with their blind tasting notes on all 300 whiskeys. And you found that their tasting notes were very similar, one to all of them. And which surprised you a bit, would have surprised me as well. I would have thought that they would have diverged a bit. What you also found was that a lot of the very expensive scotches did not hold up to some of the much cheaper blends, which I found very funny as well in this book. So again, I've got this book on order because you and I talked about this again when reviewing the questions, and you said, no, it's from this book. And my wife's ordered it, but it's not in for about 2 weeks. And I think I got it from your suggestion was Abe Books, and that's where we got it from. So that's coming in. But what we do have is, I thought that it was on this one as well. So let's talk about these books a little bit, if we could, Pip, because we did this book justice. We talked about this in quite a bit of detail in our 3rd. But could you tell me about which one came first, appreciating whiskey or Scots on Scotch?
Oh, Scots on Scotch.
Okay, so could you tell us a little bit about this? Because it seems like you did delve into your knowledge from this to refer to chapter 2 into the book, or the second epilogue. So tell us about this book. Just, I don't want to say a brief. You tell us as much about this book as you want.
Yeah, well, the genesis of this was probably in the mid-80s. it became obvious after a few years that we had done something extraordinary, that somehow we had discovered this fabulous whiskey, which the whole of the Scotch whiskey industry didn't sell, most of it didn't know about it, and that we said to ourselves, you know, how can this be? This stuff's been around for centuries. It has a big multi-million pound business behind it, and there's nobody selling this stuff. How can this be? Now, I had been interested for some time in Scotch history. I've been interested in Scotch history off and on for a large part of my life.
Right.
And I had an inkling as to what it was about. Now, what happened was the malt whiskey practically disappeared from public consciousness.
Yeah.
By the 1930s. By the 1930s, nobody, even in Scotland, drank anything but blended whiskey. And they thought, by and large, single malts weren't worth drinking. And the recovery of malt whiskey was part of a movement in Scotland which was about recovering Scotch history. What most people in Scotland knew about the history of Scotland was very much coloured by Scotland's place as a minor partner in the Great British Empire.
Right.
And Scotch history was seen through this lens for generations. But starting, I would say, probably in the 1960s, there was a new generation of historiographers who started writing about Scotch history, about Scotch social and political and technological history. And the Scots gradually came to realize that their history was a hell of a lot better than they had thought it was. That it was much more distinguished, that a great many things happened in it. I mean, for example, the 18th century Enlightenment in the second half of the 18th century of Scotland was probably one of the three seminal periods in the history of the human race. David Dykes used to say, look, there have been three great intellectual nations in the history of humanity. They have been the Greeks, the Jews, and the Scots. Now, he had an axe to grind, but the later 18th century set the pattern for the rest of human history, and the most influential place intellectually was Edinburgh. There's been no question about that at all.
Okay.
Now, most Scots didn't know about that. Most Scots know relatively little about the history of science and technology in Scotland in the 19th century, which is one of the reasons why I wrote The Star Drive. Now, this dawning awareness of the value of Scotland and Scots culture and Scots history was on its way by the 60s and 70s. Mm-hmm. And I had nothing to do with this. I just kind of latched onto it. That coincided with the rise of gastronomy in Britain.
Okay.
Now, by the 1950s, in which I was in my teens in the 50s, and believe me, Scotland was a desert Britain was a desert in terms of food and drink. Okay. And it wasn't just the poor like us who didn't get decent food and drink, and the same was true of the rich. And the seminal figure in that was a lady called Elizabeth David, who learned French cookery and wrote books about it. And if you like cooking, Elizabeth David's books are still classics. And gradually, and of course, a few people started going to France and Italy for their holidays and came across continental cuisine and continental appreciation of liquor. And gradually a movement got underway whereby people in Britain not just in Scotland, but in Britain, started asking better of their food and drink. And you got, we now end up with a kind of preposterous foodieism that you see on television. And I'm not saying that's a great thing, but it's a hell of a lot better than what it was. And that caught up with the rise, and to some extent, the rise of Scottish political nationalism, the development of a corporate consciousness in Scotland of the value of Scotland as a society. And the things came together, and a number of Scots started looking at their indigenous food and drink and saying, is this any good? Now, the foods, no, not a lot to shout about. There are some very good things, but there has never been a high tradition of cuisine in Scotland.
Okay.
That's a generalization. There are exceptions to it. But people were discovering that there could be really good drink. Now, Scotland, Edinburgh was long famous, long before it was famous on account of whiskey. Edinburgh was famous for beer.
Okay.
And Scotland have long been famous. We have, what do you need to make good beer? You need good water and good barley, and we've long had that. Yeah. And of course, what do you need to make good whiskey? You need the ale from which the barley has given rise to.
No hops. Don't need hops, but everything else that we have in beer we need. It's perfect.
And then of course there was the real ale movement came along. Now the real ale movement actually started, I think, in England.
Okay.
I mean, I didn't like beer when I was 17 or 18. I thought it was horrible. It was gassy and it was sweet, and I didn't like it. And I can remember the first time I met flat, warm, bitter English beer, which must have been in about 1959 or something like that. Okay. And I thought it was wonderful. My pals despised it because you could drink gallons and not get drunk because it was quite weak. And I thought it was great. And the same thing happened with whiskey. Some people understood that single malt whiskey could be infinitely better than the blended whiskey which people were drinking. So the things came together, and a few adventurous souls like Macallan, Glenfarclas, Glenlivet, and so on were bottling single malt, had been for a long time, but nobody knew about them, even in Scotland. But then I think one of the seminal things was David Dykes, who wrote Whiskey in Scotland, published in 1968. If you don't have that in your shelves, you must get it.
Yep.
That is, I'm proud to say that David was a good friend of mine and a great guy. And that was hugely influential because David was a major scholar and a scholar of Scottish culture, despite being himself a Jew, which is one of the ironies of the thing. His father was the first rabbi ever to live in Scotland. He came from Lithuania to escape a pogrom in the later 19th century. Wow. But anyway, all of these factors came together, and they produced the rise of interest in malt whiskies, which of course eventually produced in me and my pals the establishment of the Scotch Malt Whisky Society. So naturally, I came to say to myself, where does all this stuff come from? And I started reading Scotch history. And particularly, I read a number of texts about kilts and tartans and stuff like that. And this
that's the title of the other chapter again, kilts, tartans, and
as soon as I got into this, I was delighted. And there was so much of what I disliked. Because remember, being a Scot, that doesn't mean to say I like everything that passes for Scottish culture. A lot of it is pure shit. and a lot of the kilts and tartans stuff is. So I learned enough about it, and the conjunction of a fake version of Scottishness, which was invented in the 19th century, which coincided with a fake version of whiskey, which was the mixture of the real stuff with bad blended whiskey, that that gave rise to Scots on Scotch. Now, this has continued to be an interest of mine for quite some time, and when I said, Rebecca said, would I write an extra chapter or two, I thought, well, I might update the kilts and tartans bit, because I had learned lots of good stuff in the intervening period, hence that chapter. And there are some great stories in it, and I've got some even better ones that for one reason or another I didn't tell, and I wish I had, especially one to do with Alastair Ranaldson MacDonald's balls. That's a great story. I will tell you sometime. It's a great and totally disgraceful story about Scottish culture and one of the most important Scotsmen of 200 years ago. And it's about his balls.
All right. Well, that will be edition 3. I don't know if it'll be edition 3 of that one, or maybe it'll be edition 2 of this one, where you have some.
No, I don't see another one on that, but we might.
You have a lot of friends, Pip, and that's what happened in here. You had a lot of friends write sections of this and their own ideas as to Scots on Scotch, and so you have the introduction and you put this together, I'm guessing, right? Is that what you did? You just talked to friends, said, write me a chapter. Give me 10, 15, 20 pages on what moves you the most about Scotch.
I offered them a bottle of whiskey for a chapter.
Perfect. I could do that with friends too. Well, I'm going to make a book. I've got lots of whiskey, and one bottle per chapter I could do that. I do. And you know what? It's a beautiful book, Pip. And I haven't read it because I never read the books until I talk to the authors about it, if I can do that. So my intent would have been to talk to you about this after I've read it or while I'm reading it. But just about every third or fourth page, beautiful pictures, and I like that because Vat 69 is my favorite blended malt. I don't know why, but it is, and I've got various Vat 69 things. But a great book. Other people should get this as well. But we're going to talk about one, and I'm going to throw another quote on here. And one of the other chapter. So, here we go. And this made me laugh. It really did. So, I knew that you're a bit defiant stance in relation to the establishment. You don't like the establishment. But I got a huge chuckle when I read this. So I'm going to read the whole quote. And stick with me. It's rather long. So the religion disapproved, of course, realizing that if people were having fun in the present, they would stop worrying about what would happen in the hereafter. And if the people weren't worried about the hereafter, they wouldn't put up with a miserable religion. So later on, the forces of Victorian respectability contrived to mold the popular perception of whiskey in their own image. But again, while continuing, of course, to make a great deal of money by selling the stuff in the first place. So what's more, because they were very clever, they contrived to blind the people of much of the pleasure by mixing the whiskey with similar, but not so nice, liquor, which allowed them to make even more money while retaining the moral high ground and keeping the fun out of sight. So you were throwing shots out here to everybody. Victorian perceptions, the church, and how they dumbed down our beloved whiskey, our beloved Scotch. So this quote, and it's in the chapter Coming In From the Cold. Hopefully I didn't give too much away because people have to buy the book. Was a unique way of describing the origins of Scotch for many people in Scotland. Now, does the church and the money-making forces in Victorian respectability share equal responsibility in, and it's a very long question, pushing the profitable branded sameness that dominated prior to the emergence of the SMWS? Is it all church and Victorian respectability that dumbed this down? Money and religion.
Well, what you had in the 19th century, especially in the second half of the 19th century, remember, this was a period of enormous economic and industrial expansion. The British Empire was the greatest power the world had ever known, and it used its muscle to sell its goods. And so there emerged in Scotland a very large, wealthy middle class, which was making a lot of money out of commerce. Now, the Scotland of that period was very much permeated by the church. The social class and respectability went hand in hand with going to church, and very few people stepped out of line. Now, there was huge competition in the whiskey market for selling these poor quality blended whiskies, and the people who were selling them, the people who owned the companies which sold them, were the most respectable, most church-going of people. I probably better not to name names, but I can think of the names of a number of individuals who were chairman of major distilling conglomerates, who were also bastions of the church, and who saw nothing wrong in selling their whiskey to make big bucks, but the fact that the poor drank the stuff, they could set a moral distance between themselves. So you had the seemingly irresistible rise of blended whiskey, and some of it was very, very good. There's no question at all. But a great deal of it was very, very bad. And this didn't come to light until I think it was 1908, of all places, the borough of Islington in London.
Okay.
Now, the borough of Islington had a liquor inspector. They licensed public houses to sell liquor.
Okay.
And they got the idea that they wanted to make sure that the liquor that was being sold was what it claimed to be. And there was a great deal of Scotch whiskey being sold quite cheaply in order to suborn the toiling masses in Islington, and Islington Borough Council wanted to know about this. So they sent inspectors round the pubs, and they ordered a Scotch whiskey, and they instead of drinking it, they took it away as a sample, and they analysed the sample, and they analysed hundreds of samples, and they found that in no case was it in fact a blended whiskey. What was being sold as Scotch whiskey was pure, raw, young grain spirit.
Yeah.
Unmatured grain spirit, which must have tasted disgusting. But as I've said, as I've said elsewhere, you can drink diesel oil with ice and soda and it doesn't taste too bad.
Well, you have a diesel ship, so maybe you've had that luxury, but I can tell you, I've never tried.
And this caused a great scandal, and there was a royal commission appointed, and the royal commission required a standard to be set. And they accepted that blended whiskey was a mixture of grain spirit with malt whiskey, but they did set a minimum maturation period in cask of 3 years. And things looked up thereafter. But the fact is that rot gut liquor was being sold by the major corporations, and it took government intervention to do something about it.
So the government's not all bad. There's some good things about the government and organizations like the Scotch Whisky Association. There are good things that come of these.
I think I look if we all like to have the benefit which capitalist economies confer upon us, the dynamism and the inventiveness and the ability to deliver. Yep. But they require to be managed. And if governments don't manage them, nobody will. And
because they will make money on the backs of the poor little guy as much as they can.
And also so that they will run their economies properly. I mean, the greatest economy the world has ever known, the United States, is micromanaged via the military-industrial complex in which government spends taxpayers' money. And that's not exactly socialism, but it sure as hell is managed capitalism. And one of our problems in Britain is that a large part of our establishment doesn't believe in managing capitalism, and that's why we're in such shit now.
And that's another kettle of worms I could open up, but I'm not. I'm going to go back. I'm going to bring us back to the SMWS. So, and you're involved in, and when it took off. So we didn't discuss this. We discussed the history of it, and by way of a recap, so we could re-explain to our viewers how the SMWS was de facto created. So I'll set the scene if I may. You've just returned home, and here I have a picture of this as well. So you've just returned home in that. Yeah. Not exactly this card, but that's an equivalent. So return home from Glenfarclas with your first cask, one which you packed yourself in your much beloved 1937 4.5-liter Lagonda, and a very drafty car, very hard to drive car, but a beautiful car. You've delved out the syndicate's 1-gallon portion of single cask Scotch to each member after sampling this liquid gold in your home. They go home. And what follows, I believe, was the start of the SMWS from that point on. So when they go home and they start asking, or they finish their bottle and they tell friends about it, and the friends want a part of it. Do you think that and what followed from that point is what started the SMWS? Or do you think it was some other point further down the road where the SMWS really started?
No, that was a pretty accurate description.
Okay.
Basically, I got so many inquiries from friends of friends, from friends of
friends of friends,
from friends of the members of my syndicate, and I eventually got around to thinking, what's going on here? Because of course you must remember, I knew next to nothing about Scotch whiskey, complete amateur. And there were very few books about it in those days. Mm-hmm. But it was purely because people kept ringing me up and saying, look, you don't know me, but I'm a friend of so-and-so who's a member of your whiskey syndicate, and I've just had some of that wonderful whiskey. Can I join your syndicate? And I would say, yeah, sure, I'll take your phone number. I don't think I'm going to get any more, but if I do. So we did it again with a doubled syndicate, and the same thing happened again. So it was very obvious that, it seemed to me that the stuff was better than any whiskey I'd tasted. And so did a lot of other people. So I eventually called a meeting of the syndicate, and I said, look, guys, all your pals want to get some of this stuff. I'm fed up traipsing up to Glenfarclas to fetch it. Why don't we do something about it? So the syndicate said, well, what do you suggest we do? And I said, well, this, on sort of elementary reasoning, there is clearly a market for malt whiskey, which is not being supplied by the stuff you can buy in a liquor store.
Correct. Yeah.
Why don't we set up a company to sell this? And they all said, oh, that's a good idea. Let's do that. And somebody said, what shall we call it? And I said, well, why don't we call it the Scotch Malt Whisky Society? Now, I just said this off the top of my head, but it seemed, everybody said, yeah, that sounds like a good name for a company. And that's how it came about. And of course, like the syndicate,
yep,
the members all said, that's fine, you go and set it up and we'll be members. So I got
it feels like that. You start something and then you're the leader of it, and then everyone's behind you pushing you. Yeah, good. That's good. That's good. Keep going. Keep doing stuff.
That's how it went. I spoke to my lawyer and said, look, can you get me a company called the Scotch Malt Whisky Society? And he said, I don't know about that. He said, the registrar of companies is a bit difficult about company names, and he won't let you have a company that sounds as though it has national significance if it's not the real thing. But he said, I'll try him. I said, well, have a go. And
you had a discussion. They phoned you, had a discussion. They phoned you, and you convinced
them. That's right.
Them.
They phoned me, and the woman said, can you tell me why we should give you this sort of grand name for your company? And I said, well, we are a Scotch Malt Whisky Society, and as far as I know, there isn't any other Scotch Malt Whisky Society. And she said, oh, that sounds reasonable, and gave us the name. And it was easy.
And it was fantastic. However, and I asked you this question because I had a discussion with others as well. And it might be Nick who's on the side commenting, or Gregory down below. I'm not sure, some of them. But for me, the start was when you were convinced to get the second cask from Glenfarclas. And I think Nick's argument was it's not then, it was when they decided to go beyond Glenfarclas, when they decided to go beyond the very first thing that worked. So I didn't know if you had one perception or another. But
No, we didn't. We only ever bottled, as a syndicate, the two bottling, the first cask, and then a second bottling consisting of the second and third cask. Both of which were Glenfarclas.
Before you became the SMWS.
And then we became the SMWS. It was thereafter. And it was only once we had become the SMWS and we had bought the vaults and had a place to be. And we then decided, and I can't remember, I have no doubt at all, I wanted Glenfarclas to be the first one. So we had, I think, Glenfarclas, Glenlivet, Bowmore, and Highland Park.
I have the list. Here, I'll throw the list. Here's the first 10, which goes to reason would be the very first 10 you had. So those would have been the first 10 going in. Glenfarclas, I can't even read my mom. So
yes, that's right. We bottled Auchentoshan as number 5 for some reason. And I must say, I never liked Auchentoshan.
Maybe you liked more flavor. And I don't want to say that because I'm okay with Auchentoshan. I do like the 3-wood, but I like the Valinch, which is the cask strength. And that's probably because of you and the SMWS. But the older versions of it, something that I would have bought in about 10 years ago. Let's delve back into the history. And why we have this book now is because you left. Or were forced out. We're going to talk about that in a second. And then you came back, and hence the 40th anniversary, and hence the writing of this book itself. So the new, and I have a quote, as I always do with some of them. So the new and careful management. Let's do that. So the new and careful management, having fired me as chairman, offered me the position of staying on in some purely honorary and ceremonial capacity, but with no say in how the thing was to be run. So we skirted over this portion of the SMWS history in our last 3 Whisky Book Club sessions. But I'd like to ask you how this offer is different than what was recently proposed to bring you back into the fold, because there was that offer to keep you on, but there was an offer to bring you back into the fold. So maybe we could talk about how Richard Goslin approached you, gave you a copy of, and I'd really like a copy of this if you could ever get it to me, Pip, An Honest Tale. So he showed you that copy. If I could get that, I would love it, please. And he interviewed you, and he wrote an article in Unfiltered magazine. And yeah, I'd like to know how that happened. And I'm going to focus on you for about 3 minutes as you talk about this, because I want this to be your picture as you talk about it.
Well, I had hired Richard Gordon back in the early 90s. Maybe about 93, something like 94. I had a succession of managing directors. You must remember that I never claimed to any expertise in management, and I always relied on other people to actually run the nuts and bolts of the company. So, after our latest manager departed, I looked around, and this guy, Richard Gordon, had come to see me because he liked the society. He was working for Glenmorangie at the time. And he came to see me and said, look, if you ever need someone to run this. So I eventually hired him as managing director with a brief to make the thing work financially and commercially, because it was a bit iffy at the time. But I have to say he was a great disappointment to me, because it was certainly my belief that he colluded with my opponents in the company and eventually was part of my getting chucked out. It was a very sad state of affairs, and it hurt me deeply. No question about that. But life goes on. You take the good with the bad, and it was decided that it was precipitated by our bank overdraft. There's a long, sad story about that, and I found myself pretty well powerless. Just having sunk a lot of my own money into the company. And
well, not just money, time, effort, and aspirations. And you're thinking about this when you start something and you give birth to a notion and something and the creation of it. You put more than just money into it. It's your time. It's your a piece of your soul. I don't want to sound
exactly. I put my life into it. The ethos of the society was largely a reflection of my views on life.
Have fun, enjoy.
I had a lot of fun, and the members loved it because the members had fun as well. But the opposition, there were a lot of people on the board who were members of that desperately dreary Scottish commercial middle class, who didn't like it at all, who saw being a director of the society as being a road to social prestige and things like that, things which I despised. But, the opposition colluded with the bank. I mean, I don't know much of the details. So at the end of the day, they said I could come back, but as a titular head. And basically they would run the show in rather a dreary fashion. And so I said, piss off, it's not the sort of guy I am. That's not the sort of life I want to lead. And there's one old guy who was a director and who was very much part of this, whose name, out of decency, I won't mention because he's dead, which is good.
Which is good.
You know, I hope the bastard died in misery. But oh dear.
Did I get you off topic?
I didn't want to be part of an organization that was run in that sort of way.
Okay.
So I left, and as I I got on with my life. Unlike a lot of these people, I had a whole lot of other things to do.
And I showed a lot of the books that you did do, and you did things beyond writing these books, but you have several other books. And I'm going to even put them up there. Keep talking, Pip, but I'll just show people the other books you wrote while after you left them. You had that. And these are not in order. I'm sorry, they're not in order. And this was your last book prior to The Founder's Tale.
Yes, I mean, that
would have taken a lot of research, I think, for this book.
Yes, it did, but it was great research, and it's a great story, and it's a great Scottish story. And sometime when you have time, I'll tell you about it. But I was also building my boat at the time, and and life went on, and I said, look, if I'm not part of it, I'm not coming near it. And I think I say in the Maverick, in the Coming In From the Cold, that in nearly 20 years, I only ever walked up the stair to the vault once. And shall I tell that story?
Well, yes, you should. And that, as well as, well, and I'll throw a quote up that goes perfectly with this. So I'm going to look for that while you talk. But yes, let's tell that story as you're coming in. You're coming in from the cold, up the stairs, and what you said.
Yeah, well, somebody had asked me to a meeting in the vault's members' room, and I had said, okay, I would go to it. So I had been building my boat in Granton, and I went up the stair. Now, when I got to the top of the stair, I found a uniformed doorman. Now, a uniformed doorman is the sort of thing that you used to have at the doors of some of the really posh London clubs.
Right. Now, which is what the new management wanted this
precisely.
to be.
They wanted it to be like a posh London club. Now, people don't have a huge amount of fun in posh clubs.
No,
not the kind of fun that I can't fund. They may have strippers and things like that, but I
don't know about that part of those clubs, but
I've been in some great London clubs. There's no question, but they're not the kind of place I want to spend my life in.
Okay.
Although several have offered to make me members. But there's this guy, this doorman, and it's obvious that I've got to get past him to get into the society. And he says, who am I, and why am I here? And I could see him looking down. And okay, I was a bit dirty. I was wearing jeans, and there was quite a lot of sawdust on my boots. But look, I've gone into the Reform Club in Pall Mall, looking pretty scruff. But the Reform Club is a really posh club.
Okay.
And on that occasion, I had forgot I was wearing a jersey. And the servitors explained to me very politely that there was a dress code and gentlemen weren't allowed in unless they had a jacket. So they loaned me a jacket, and there was no problem.
But not this guy.
That's real class.
Yes.
That's not pretension. That is real old style sort of class, and I like it. But
this doorman,
this guy, it's obvious I'm not going to get past him unless I can and he says, "Do I have a membership card?" And I said, "I guess I do, but I don't know where it is." And exactly. And he said, and I say, "Well, I can tell you my number." And he says, "What is it?" And I said, 1. And I could just see him. Something sort of, he was having a very bad day.
Okay.
And he went off and found one of the staff who let me in. But no, it wasn't my sort of thing at all. And now the whole point about coming back from the cold,
Yep,
is that when Richard Goslin approached me and said there had been the suggestion that I might like to come back to the society, and I was deeply suspicious, but he said, could he come and see me? And he did.
and talk.
And I thought he was a really good guy. I liked him immediately, and he came and we sat on the sofa, you can see behind me.
Okay.
And we had a cup of coffee, and he told me about it and said, how did I feel about it? And I said, well, I'll come and look at the place and come and talk to the people. And it was when I came and talked to the people, and of course the company had been through various hands since then. And I came back and I spoke to the people, and I liked them all. I thought they were terrific. They were the kind of people that I would have appointed. So
and I'm going to read the quote. Here's the quote of when you saw them, when you came back. So it says, we're just continuing with the decision of you playing a role. So you go there, and this for the first time. A few years have passed since that meeting, and I can tell you that my first impressions were not misleading. They're a great bunch. Smart, intelligent, committed, hugely knowledgeable about the stuff they sell, and happy to impart that knowledge, which they do without a trace of condescension. They are an embodiment of the values and attitudes which are the root of the Scotch Malt Whisky Society, and, as you may imagine, I am more than pleased. So I loved reading that. So that's high praise, for one. And let's just elaborate on what specifically gave you this impression when you came in for the first time, coming out of the cold and going up.
I couldn't be specific. It was all quite vague.
Just the feeling that you had.
It was unmistakable, the whole ethos of the thing. Now, remember, the people who had got rid of me from the society were the kind of people who valued social status. They were the kind of people who in my view, and I should say in everything I'm saying here,
it's your view. But it's your book, so you're allowed to have a view with your book.
I'm not representing anybody, but we had always been clear from the beginning that this was not intended to be for posh people. We were bottling this whiskey so that people like ourselves of modest means could get their hands on the finest spirit in the known universe, which just happened to be our national drink. Now, I mean, that doesn't go together with high social status, but there is a large section of the Scottish middle class, or used to be, which values status above almost anything else. And a lot of my opposition were people of that sort. And there was an antithesis. Now, the society ran profitably after I left under Richard Gordon. Whatever Richard was and is, he is a good manager.
Okay.
And eventually the company was taken over by Glenmorangie. Now, Glenmorangie was an extremely well-run company. It still is. And it prospered modestly under Glenmorangie, but it didn't set the heather on fire. And I tell this story, I think it's maybe germane to go on to that story, because it's part of the explanation of why the people were different. Now,
okay, let's do that.
The society, by the early 20 teens, the society was doing all right And it had accumulated. Remember that when we were buying whiskey originally, nobody wanted the stuff. Nobody wanted mature malt in the 1980s. And so we were buying it cheaply. And the society bought lots of good whiskey, either mature or maturing. And by 2014, 2015, it was sitting on large stocks of exceptionally fine liquor. Now, the Glenmorangie itself had been taken over by a French conglomerate company called LVMH, Louis Vuitton Moet et Hennessy. It describes itself as the world's leading luxury goods group.
Right.
Now, you don't want to hear my opinion on luxury goods or the sort of folk who buy them. But from all I hear, it was and is an extremely well-run company. And, you know, if they can make big bucks from selling expensive watches and stuff like that, by all means. The rich have got to spend their money on something. But it became obvious that the Scotch Malt Whisky Society was not a natural fit. Remember, the people who buy luxury goods are, first of all, rich people. Secondly, they are people who, by and large, want to impress other rich people
with their
who
stuff.
are probably as ignorant as themselves. Because very few people, I mean, the person who buys a Patek Philippe watch doesn't know how the watch works any more than the person who buys fabulously expensive champagne knows much, by and large, about how champagne is made. You know, the rich are like that. They buy goods, they don't make them.
Yes.
And again, there are exceptions to all of these things, but I think the generalizations are true. Now, so luxury goods are sold to people who believe advertising, who have little intrinsic knowledge of what it is that they are buying, but who purchase status by means of it. The Scotch Malt Whisky Society, even then, was still predicated on the basis of a rational appreciation of liquor. It was based on the idea that the average whiskey drinker is equipped with the ability to discern the quality of fine liquor. And indeed, the whole point of the society is exactly that, to encourage individual drinkers to discern for themselves the flavors in their liquor. Now, this is an ethos which is critical and rational and democratic. And you don't have to be a genius to see that that's not exactly a natural fit with Louis Vuitton, Moet and Hennessy. Now, I should say, in all I'm saying here, these are my views as a person, and I have been asked to make it quite clear that they do not represent the views of the board of the Scotch Malt Whisky Society. But for some reason, these guys put up with me. Again, it's the propensity to tell it straight. And anyway, the story goes on. It became obvious there were two things happened. First of all, LVMH were a bit uncomfortable with the Whisky Society and wouldn't be averse to disposing of it. Secondly, the second part of the story was that because of what we did all these years ago, there had grown up a class of investors in whiskey, speculators who sought to make a buck by buying whiskey, holding it on, and eventually selling it as a profit. Speculators. Now, there is a class of speculator called an asset stripper.
Yes.
And these are people who seeing a company whose assets are undervalued, buy the company, close the company down, and sell off the assets as
Rip
profit.
it up.
And by 2015, the company, there were asset strippers eyeing the Scotch Malt Whisky Society and considering making Glenmorangie an offer for the company as a whole, with a view to selling the assets and closing the company down, disposing of the society. Now, there is a white knight in this till. And the white knight, as far as I'm concerned, and I do my best to do justice to him because he's a very good bloke and I like him. And he has to be given credit. I think the main person to be given credit for saving the society. Because remember, what the society was facing was destruction.
Yep. Stripped.
And the guy's name, I think I'm allowed to say it, was Paul Skipworth. And
Finally, we had
Paul,
3 other sessions and you didn't say his name, and finally you said it. And the quote, salvation of the society is not well-known stuff, and you said he doesn't want to be named.
Well,
he wanted just
Paul, forgive me if I speak out of turn, but everything I've been able to discover was Paul was chairman of Glenmorangie.
Okay.
So he was the boss.
Okay.
And he's a very, very savvy sort of chap. And Paul liked the society, still does. And he had a number of friends in Edinburgh and London who also liked the society and who were also in a position to see what was likely to happen to it. And Paul brought together a group of investors and they made Glenmorangie an offer and they bought the company from Glenmorangie. And they took it from being part of a public company to being a private company again.
Right.
And I'm no party to the discussions which happened then, but my understanding is that the brief they gave, they changed the management. They brought in a lot of new and very good management. And they gave the management of the new company the brief, one part of their brief, obviously to run the thing well, but part of the brief was to try to recover some of the excitement and the fun which had characterized the Scotch Malt Whisky Society in its early days.
And that gives me the perfect chance, Pip. I'm just going to bring in our other 2 members now, because this is essentially, well, Rob prior to this, but I want to ask Rob Carpenter, who's the co-founder with his lovely wife of the SMWS Canada, and Gregory Perlinski, who's been in with me many a time. Rob, we're going to turn off your mic for a second because that's you. There we go. And Gregory coming in because Gregory is he's been except for one other person, Nick, my buddy, has been to as many SMWS tastings with me as possible, and he's been to more than I have, anyways.
Hi guys, so, nice to see you.
And we're going to ask Rob in a second. Well, let's ask him now. Rob, we're going to ask you now, but we'll ask you to mute your computer before you do that. So I think that's F4, F5, something like that, which will mute you, and then you can talk and we won't get that feedback. When did you come into the society, Rob? I think it was 2005 or 2008, and it's prior or bought by Glenmorangie, I
think. We came in to the society. Well, we started coming in about 2005, 2006, because we had a long period of courting the society to try to open a Canadian branch. It took us 5 years before we could actually open a Canadian branch. which we did in 2011. And prior to that, and we were dealing with at the very beginning, we were dealing with your friend Richard Gordon, Pip, because he was still involved. And then after that, there was a fellow named Paul Miles, who was involved. But we opened the Canadian branch while Glenmorangie was still the owner, and then LVMH came in and so on. So yeah.
Rob, did you notice a vast difference in how they related to you or how the company was run prior to Louis Vuitton and then post?
No, we, as a branch, we're not really well connected with what we call HQ. HQ manages sourcing of the whiskeys. They manage, the overall venues and so on. We're a little bit of a satellite, way off in the distance from their perspective, I think. So, if we see a little bit of it in certain amount of bureaucracy that has grown up as the society has become bigger and more corporate, but that's just a natural evolution of any company, I think.
Okay. And I'm going to give you the chance now, Rob, because I have this right there. And there's a link to this and you and the SMWS. So this is your first. And you know what? I don't know if this is your first bottle from your distillery, which you'll talk about, or is it the first one available in Canada? I'm wondering. So
that is the inaugural release from Holyrood.
Nice.
So that is the first single malt whiskey that we have released from the distillery. Came out in October last year, pretty much sold out everywhere, which is a nice thing to say, but not surprising for an inaugural release, because people tend to buy that one. It's getting them to buy the follow-up is a little different, but the reality is that Holyrood has a lot of themes of the society in it, and so I think we, as a business and in terms of the way we approach things, owe a fair amount to Pip and his original ideas of not taking things too seriously, having a bit of fun, and just trying to release beautiful things that people enjoy. And that's really what we're trying to do. We're not trying to take ourselves too seriously.
Well, it's a serious whiskey, which we like, and that's I'm happy that you have. However, the last time we talked 2.5 years ago, we also talked about possibly having the new make attached to that bottle, if you remember. And I'm wondering if there's any possible way I can get new make, so that when I do a tasting of this with the Alberta Scotch Society, we could have the new make and see what happens after a certain amount of years in wood. So I'm throwing that out there.
Well, we do new make, and we will do less of it now that we have whiskey to release. But the thing with us is that we don't do one style. We do, and again, this is one of the themes that I think has either consciously or subconsciously come from the society, is we are the most innovative distillery in Scotland, I think, in terms of using different mash bills and malt recipes and yeasts and so on, because we are trying to create flavor before whiskeys go into cask, and trying to create a complexity around our whiskeys. So we could give you new make, but it wouldn't necessarily be the new make that
from that one
that was the predecessor to Arrival, or any of the other things that we might release in future.
All right. I got to try, though. I had to try. Thank you for that, kind sir. Gregory, let's focus on you just for a quick second. Did you have any questions? Because you were down there and I wasn't looking at the questions on the side.
So. Oh, no, no questions. Do you have a sort of a concern with the society I might just want to throw up is lately we're going a lot towards what I think is sort of the opposite of the original intention to keep everything, this base it on the dram and not on the marketing, because now like we have all these like the new wave, like everything's becoming like a little, here's this, here's that, here's this little group of releases, that paintings on some, no paintings on others. The bottles for the blended malts, they all stand out. Shouldn't we be keeping it just the same packaging on everything and just saying, hey, flavor first, instead of trying to sub branch? And
I agree with you completely.
okay,
I set my face against all that stuff. The problem with it is that every innovation of that sort dilutes the original message. And what the society has is its unique approach to whiskey. And every marketing venture that produces a picture or varies the presentation dilutes the central message. And I have said this to management more than once. And, my personal view, but the problem is that it's now a PLC. It has professional managers, and a lot of these people are mostly whiskey industry people. So it's not as eccentrically unique an enterprise as once it was, I think. But having said that, I think there's a good chance that that the wheel has come full circle, and that there are people seeing that it's better to stay with the single unique sort of presentation, and depend on members being willing to work at understanding what's going on. But remember, when we started this, everybody said, you can't have a whiskey that doesn't tell you the distillery name on the bottle. What, you're going to have numbers on the bottle and no names? You must be nuts. Nobody can sell whiskey like that. But the fact is, members like it. And people are prepared to work at understanding what it's all about. And, insofar as my advice these days counts for anything, and frankly, I'm not sure how much it counts for. It might count for a lot. It might count for next to nothing. And sometimes I suspect they think I'm just a nuisance.
No, never.
But remember, there are a lot of people, and there are a lot of bright people, and they know what they're doing. And some things that have happened which I didn't much like, I've had to admit that I was wrong. We all get it wrong sometimes, but I have to say I agree with you on that one. I think it's a mistake. I think we should stick to the rigorous bottle labeling system.
Excellent. Good job there, Greg. And good segue into our next question, actually, guys. So, Pip, in Coming In From the Cold, you describe how the SMWS, and this is important, began the entire notion of recreational whiskey. So that's a quote we actually have in there that came in there, and which are now so commonplace. And I have to thank you for that, because my organization, the Alberta Scotch Society, I'm the president. It's our primary social activity are the tastings. And I have to say, it's definitely innocent fun that I look forward to every month. If I'm having a hard day or a hard week, I know it's going to come up, and it lifts my spirits. Even though there's work involved in organizational, it makes me happy. Now, I'm wondering, how did this notion manifest itself? Was it meant to be initially fun or educational, or both, or more one than the other? And I'm wondering when that came in, that first tasting, please, to other people, as opposed to just the panel.
The two things came together. Remember when we started the society, we had a few dozen members.
Okay.
Basically the old syndicate and some of their pals. And we bottled 4 casks. The first 4 casks, the Glenfarclas, Glenlivet, Bowmore, and Highland Park. And we thought if we're going to, if the society, I was confident that the thing would simply expand because people would drink the whiskey and give their friends whiskey, and people would join as they had done to my syndicate. But we thought we ought to have a way of telling people what the whiskey was like. Now, the question was, how do you tell what whiskey tastes like? Because remember, nobody had ever thought of giving verbal descriptions to whiskey in 1983.
Right.
It seems incredible now, but nobody had ever thought of it. And what we did was we came up with the idea, well, why don't we adopt wine tasters type terminology? Because generations wine tasters had been describing the flavors of wine. We thought, why don't we adopt wine tasters terminology? Now, we were fortunate in that one of the original members of the syndicate and of the society was a chap called Russell Sharp. Now, Russell was a brewer by trade.
Is he in this picture? Is Russell in here?
No, Russell's not in that picture.
Okay, sorry. I just wanted to say how much.
But,
Okay, sorry.
Russell was part of the whiskey industry. He was our original source of inside information because he had been chief chemist at Shivers Group, which meant he was in charge of a very large part of the malt whiskey industry. And Russell knew about description of flavor. And I think it was Russell who suggested that, that we use verbal descriptions. And so we set up, we decided that what we would do is tell people we would have a newsletter, which a printed newsletter, it was only a single sheet that we would send out to our members, and we would describe the whiskies in terms of their flavor. So the problem was that we had to think, how do we arrive at these descriptions? And I think I can reasonably claim the credit for saying, right, guys, what we're going to do is set up a tasting committee. That's to say, 4 or 5 of us, and we'll sit round a table and we'll drink a whole lot of whiskey and we'll describe it. We'll talk about it. We'll use words to describe it, and we'll put the words in the newsletter that describe the whiskey we're tasting. And that's what we did, and that's the origin of the idea of verbal descriptions of whiskey. But we're running the thing from this ancient building in the vaults, and it's a building society, and it's chaos, and people are coming and they're wanting to taste whiskey, and we let them taste it. And by that time we had a few hundred members who were spread throughout Scotland and particularly throughout England. And somebody came up with the idea, well, why don't we offer to go out and take the whiskies to the members? And everybody thought that was a grand idea. Let's go out and take the whiskey to the members. So we communicated with our members and said, look, guys, if we were to come to your area and bring some whiskey, would you like to come and taste it? And the members were all delighted. They said, yeah, sure. So we set up what were probably the first ever recreational whiskey tastings. That's to say, we hired various swanky venues. And we thought we might as well give it a touch of class, because even that early we realized that this was really the best. And so we went out to various places, told members we were coming, took some whiskey with us, and they loved it. And basically they all stuck their nose in whiskey and said, what have you said about this? And we would provide the tasting notes for each of the whiskies, and everybody loved it. And that was literally the start of recreational malt whiskey tasting. Nobody had ever thought of it before. And
Now,
it was,
when would that have been, Pip? Would that be after 2 or 3 years of you having the society, do you think? Or was it a little bit later?
no, it would be within 2 or 3 years, I would say.
Okay, good.
There were two. There were. Do you want me just to go on talking about this?
Absolutely. I think it's great.
There
Pay
were
homage
two,
to the history of it.
there were two or three events which made all the difference.
Yeah.
Now, at the time, I mean, I was only doing all this as as a hobby.
Right.
We had Anne Dana and Susan, I think it was, who were our only employees. and I didn't get paid for anything I did for the society for about the first 12 years of its existence. And I got the heave shortly after that. So, at the time, I was running a business. As a highly unorthodox expert on taxation. I was a sort of tax accountant.
Okay.
I had done a spell in as Her Majesty's Inspector of Taxes in the Inland Revenue.
Okay.
So I knew about the UK tax system, and I found myself. Well, I eventually left because it was boring, and I found myself. They paid me an amazing amount of money, and they flew me down to London to ask me why I was resigning, and I had to tell them I was bored. But I found myself, without intending to, having lots of clients of people who were in trouble with the tax authorities and wanted me to get them out of it.
Okay.
And I was running this, and I was running it from my house in Scotland Street, and I had a secretary called Penny, and Penny was a really nice, bright woman. And Penny and I would go out to lunch each day, and we would have long lunches and we'd go to bookshops and things like that. So it was a fairly laid-back sort of business.
Nice.
But it made us quite a lot of money. And Penny was a lady, and then I suppose she must have been in her 40s, and she had a lover called Conrad. And Conrad Wilson was his name. He's dead now, so I can tell you. So is she. Conrad was a journalist, and he had a great job. He was the Scotsman's food, wine, and music correspondent. The Scotsman was the Edinburgh newspaper. So every now and then he wrote a piece about food or wine or classical music.
Okay.
And one day, Conrad would take Penny to lunch quite often. And one day when they were having lunch, Conrad said, I've heard Pip's up to something down in Leith. What's going on? And Penny told him what she knew. She said, you should speak to him. So Conrad rang me up and said, what's going on? And I told him. Oh, he said, that's very interesting. I said, come and taste the stuff. It's good. It's the best. Now, as part of his business as the Scotland newspaper's wine correspondent, he had the Scotsman's wine tasting club.
Okay.
Now, this consisted of Conrad and 5 or 6 of his fellow journalists. And what they did was once a month, they tasted a range of wines. Mm-hmm. And they described them. Conrad wrote an article in the Saturday Scotsman, and they described all these wines and described what they tasted like, and they rated them. Perfect. In points out of 100 for quality. Now, it was a great scam because these guys, like most journalists, were pretty hard drinkers. Yeah. And the people who made the wines, of course, were delighted to have their wines appear in a prestigious national newspaper like this. So these guys got all the wine for free, and all they had to do was drink the wine for a couple of hours on a Saturday, and Conrad would write it up, and they took all the bottles home. It was a lovely scam, and it ran for years and years.
Oh, good for him.
And Conrad said to the guys, he said, look, Pip's doing something odd with whiskies in Leith. And he says, we could maybe come and taste his whiskies. And they all said, well, that's a great idea. So I arranged that Conrad and his wine taster should come to the vaults and should taste the first 4 whiskies. Now, I should explain that they gave the wines points out of 100 in terms of quality, and the highest they had ever accorded a wine, it was a Grand Cru Bordeaux. I think it was Chateau Calvo, and they had given it 83 points out of 100. 83. That was the highest they'd ever given anything. So
you don't want anything under 90 points on all these things with wines now that are out there. 83, well, that's surprising.
They were very rigorous, and they stuck to it.
Okay.
And they came down to the vaults, and I lined up the 4 whiskies, and we drank them, and they liked them.
Good.
And they went away, and they discussed it, and then Conrad wrote an article for the Scotsman. If you get onto the society, I'm sure they'll find you a copy of that article. There is one. I took it for them. And they rated our whiskies. And the lower, I won't tell you what rating they gave to which.
Okay.
But the lowest rating was 95. And the highest was the Highland Park, to which they gave 99. And they said they said it was the best liquor they had ever drunk. And the only reason they didn't give 100 was that was the unattainable.
Oh, okay. So they give points for it.
Conrad's article appeared in the Scotsman, and a lot of people read it, and we got a rush of people wanting to join the society and buy it.
Which is what you were all about, Pip. You were all about getting the free publicity and promoting.
Well, it was all about it was all a lark. We were having great fun, and it was all true. I mean, these guys knew what they were doing. They said this is just the best distilled liquor in the known universe. I mean, you cannot get better than this, and they were right.
I agree. I don't know. It's very hard to get better than non-chill filtered, single cask. It's everything we want. And
the second thing, the second event that happened, this was when we'd been going about 2 or 3 years. I decided to, I had set the thing up and just kind of let it run because I had other things to do. And but I decided to sort of push it along a bit. And it was running very nicely and expanding by word of mouth. But I asked around, I knew a number of people in the wine business. And I asked around and I said, look, who is the most authoritative wine writer in Britain? And they all said the same thing. No question about it, Jancis Robinson.
Okay.
She compiled the Oxford Book of Wines and all sorts of other books. And she wrote for the Sunday Times, which was Britain's biggest upper-class newspaper.
Right.
And huge circulation and in AB social categories. And the only trouble was that Jancis Robinson was feared by people in the trade because she was famously ferocious, and she she didn't suffer fools gladly. And I thought, well, I might as well try. So I found a phone number for her and I rang her up. And she said very fiercely, who was I and what did I want? And the implication was that I better piss off pretty quick. And I told her who I was. And I said, I have here some Scotch whiskey. And I said, I think it is the best distilled liquor on the planet. And I want to show it to you. And if you don't agree with me, you can show me the door. It won't take you more than 5 minutes. Mm-hmm. And she said afterwards that she was quite taken by my effrontery and by the description. And she said, okay. And it was agreed that I could take some whiskey and pair a visit. So I put the 4 bottles, the Glenfarclas, etc. I put a bottle of each with some nosing glasses into a flight case, and I took a flight to London, and I took a taxi up to her house in North London, and I lined up the 4 glasses, and I said, 5 minutes. And I have to say, she was in person very affable. She wasn't fierce to me at all.
Not scary at all. But you were like her. You were a bit upfront and you were honest, and maybe she's just upfront and honest, Pip. And people
yes,
just
I think she responded to that. There was no messing. There was no marketing pitch or anything like that. I said, this is just the best distilled liquor in the known universe, which was not an extravagant claim because, of course, we don't know of any distilled liquor beyond our present solar system. But she said she sampled them. She didn't take long about it. And she said, well, what's the story? So I told her the story. And she wrote it up for the Sunday Times magazine. And she sent a photographer up to Leith. And the thing just exploded. Nice. There were thousands of people clamoring to become members. And that's what established. And lots after that, I mean, I made it my business to get press. And I did it all on the same basis, basically, of effrontery and saying to people that it's great stuff. There's no bullshit about it. If you don't like it, I'll get lost. I won't hang around. But it is just marvelously fine liquor, and they all agreed with me. And I've got a file of press cuttings that thick. Not just, all the quality newspapers in the United Kingdom, in France, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times.
Nice. And you know what? I'm guessing the SMWS has a historian, and if they don't, they should hire you. Or, better yet, they should hire me, and I'll get all your stuff, and I'll become the new expert on the SMWS.
Most of the stories are in the book. All the ones that I can decently tell. I got up, besides running the Whisky Society for 12 years, I got up to a whole lot of other things, but these are things that I can't decently
write about.
Tell you about.
I got it. So the SMWS, first ones to do, let's say, single barrel. And I know there's others that came fairly close to you when they did single barrels as well. And I was talking to Ian Buxton in his job, and he had doing one of the very first single barrels in his early career. But so let's say you're the first. Let's say organizational wise, where you do it all: single barrel, non-chill filter, no coloring. Perfect. First ones to do tastings, which is great. And also the first ones, and I didn't know this, so I'm going to say that, responsible for the wide use of finishes to improve the flavor of malt whiskey. Now, I didn't know that you were the first to do finishes. And I know there was the description, but I would have assumed, that other distilleries out there would have thrown their whiskeys into a different barrel for 6 months, a year, 2 years, 3 years. But you state that you're the first ones that did that. And Beyond that, there's a quote as well I want to throw up there. It's a practice right here. And I'd like you to tell us what you meant by this, please. So it is a practice in which, having become widespread, is open to abuse and could in time present an existential danger to the whole industry. So we're talking about finishing whiskeys now, or what some people call acing the whiskeys, if we want to go to those individuals, but finishing, acing whiskeys to finish it off. How is that an existential danger to the whole industry, please, Pip?
I better be careful about what I say here.
No, Pip, you say whatever you want, doesn't matter.
Again, I should say that nothing I say represents company policy.
Yes.
That's my personal view. I think it's a heap of shit for the most part. I think the practice of finishing whiskies was introduced originally by Bill Lumsden in Glenmorangie.
Okay.
Bill Lumsden was and is a very scrupulous person and a very good scientist.
Okay.
And
Yes.
Glenmorangie is a very scrupulous and very good whiskey company.
Good.
No, I've never had any problem with either of these people. And Bill had the clever idea. What he had in his hands was 10-year-old Glenmorangie matured in bourbon casks. Now, that is, in my opinion, a great malt whiskey. But he was obviously under pressure to I'm not sure quite when this is happening. This must have been in the 1990s. No, they'd be in the early 90s. I think there was probably management pressure saying, look, by that time, the market was kind of starting to fragment and to articulate itself. And I think probably Bill was under pressure. Management was saying, look, are there no variants we can do here? So what Bill did was he took the lovely 10-year-old bourbon cask whiskey and he steeped some of it in a sherry cask for a year or two, some of it in a port, some of it in a Madeira cask. I think with varied results. I think the sherry cask was good. I didn't like the Madeira.
Okay.
The port was okay. My problem with that lot, and I remember talking to Bill about it from New York. He actually rang me on my mobile at one point when I was doing the tasting in New York and asked me about it, and I told him what I thought of it. I think their problem was that they were taking whiskey which was already absolutely first rate and very distinctive, namely a 10-year-old bourbon cask Glenmorangie. And okay, they were altering it in ways which appealed to some people, but they didn't appeal to me, just personally. I still think it. They interestingly, they now have brought it back and they call it Glenmorangie Original.
The 10.
And it's cheaper than the finished products. And I think I like it a lot better. But Glenmorangie has always been a very well-run company, and they were always at a time when much of the whiskey industry viewed us with extreme disfavor. Glenmorangie were always obliging and friendly, I have to say. So I've always carried a can from Glenmorangie.
And what's the danger of? I think I know your answer to this, but I'm asking anyways. What do you think the danger is of using the finishes within?
Oh yes, sorry, I didn't carry on.
That's okay.
What you've got to realize is that there is practically no original thinking within the whiskey industry.
Okay.
All do what somebody else is doing. Nobody. Remember, they're mostly corporations, and people who run corporations don't like taking risks. So they all run about holding each other's tails. And people saw that Glenmorangie was selling its finished whiskies. And they were all selling their boring whiskies and not selling much of them. And they thought, why don't we do that? So other people started finishing whiskies. Now, I knew Bill Lumsden, and I knew that if Bill was going to finish a Glenmorangie in, I should say, a sherry cask, he would buy a really first-class sherry cask, and he would leave it long enough to acquire the flavor characteristics he wanted and no longer. And that he would be very critical and very careful about the whole thing. But this does not apply to the horde of second-raters who decided to follow in his wake. And the result is that we now see throughout the Scotch whisky industry whiskies which are finished in all sorts of bizarre ways, in all sorts of casks. We see lots of whiskies finished in casks which had traditionally practically nothing to do with whiskey. Whiskey is good if you mature, can be good if you mature it in a cask which has held a fortified wine like sherry, port, Madeira, and various others.
Yep.
But
Armagnac.
whiskey which has been finished in a cask which has held red Tuscan wine is a different matter altogether. And I think I said that in the book at some point. And there are all sorts of people, imitators, doing this. And the result is that there is lots of crap whiskey out there.
Okay. And I'll throw some other ones out there, Pip. How about rum finish or tequila finish or a mezcal barrel?
Precisely. What affinity is there between tequila and Scotch whiskey, or even rum? I mean, rum's great liquor. I love rum.
Yeah.
But the best thing to do with rum is to put it in a good bourbon cask, as they've been doing for generations. And but tequila, for God's sake, I ask you. But the thing is, you have creeps in marketing departments who are trying to make a mark and trying to earn a buck. Let's face it. This is what commerce, this is what capitalism is about. We're all trying to get a bit of the action. But there is a lot of bad whiskey out there, and there seems to be a conspiracy of enthusiasts whereby nobody ever turns around and says this is rubbish.
Okay.
You know what I'm talking about.
They just keep promoting and promoting.
Have you ever given whiskey to who has tasted it and say that's horrible? I don't like it. People are intimidated by the ethos which has developed around malt whiskey, whereby people are very reluctant to say, well, that's crap whiskey. And the result is that there is lots of whiskey being sold which isn't very good. And some of it tastes nasty. And of course, what we now have is a proliferation of new distilleries, and all the new distilleries are trying. They're all producing spirit. They all produce pretty much the same stuff. You can't really tell the difference between spirit from one new distillery from half a dozen others. Maybe they can, but you and I can't.
They have to be doing something special with their new make. They have to be doing something.
So they're all trying to find a unique selling point, and there isn't one except by messing about with it. Now, the more you mess about with it, the more you dilute the central message of malt whiskey, well made, matured in a fine cask, in quite a narrow range of casks. That is a great liquor, but there is lots and lots of stuff which may legally be called Scotch whisky, which is not great liquor by any reasonable standard. Now, my point is simply that there is no legal control. Remember that the important thing in the history that we talked about earlier was the legislation in, I think, 1909, which laid down what may be called Scotch whisky. It had to be made from malted barley or grain, and it had to be distilled in a certain way, and it had to be matured for 3 years in cask. And it couldn't be called Scotch whisky if that wasn't the case. Now, we have all sorts of variants which may be called Scotch whisky, which I fear are bringing whisky into disrepute. And that's what I mean when I'm saying that. And I know I should be hugely unpopular for saying it, because it's a kind of, the whisky industry is a kind of co-prosperity sphere in which, as long as it's all going up, everybody benefits.
Yes.
We all say it's all good stuff. But sooner or later, some little boy is going to point out that one particular emperor doesn't have any clothes, and it's terribly vulnerable. It's not my place to be that person, but sooner or later. And if that happens, there's going to be a major crash.
Okay. And so, well, again, you don't like the bastardization of whiskey. You don't. But finishing, the SMWS does finish, and they do have good barrels. So what's the difference between it? So where is it positive, like Glenmorangie does, and where does it become negative? So what's the line for you, Pip?
I think it's in the care with which you do it, and in the very limited range of casks which you use for it.
Okay, so let's leave it at that. That's perfect.
Okay. The society, when it's maturing whiskey, is mostly laying down Oloroso sherry cask. There's no question that Oloroso sherry is about as good as it gets.
So
I have suggested to them that they might try laying down Enfino or Manzanilla or Palo Cortada or, Añejo Fino or something like that. There are a lot of different kinds of sherry, and the whiskey industry has focused purely on Oloroso. I don't see why. I don't know that I have ever actually tasted whiskey matured for 10 years in a good Fino cask. I may have done, but it would be interesting to see it.
I have had Fino cask, but like you said, I don't know if it was matured. It might have just been finished. Of course, PX. We've all had the PX whiskeys as well. All right.
Let me tell you about Pedro Jimenez.
Please do.
The PX, which is used mostly for faking whiskey and to give color to it.
Okay.
I have made an original discovery as regards Pedro Jimenez sherry.
Okay.
It's great. It's great poured over ice cream.
Okay. Yeah.
It really is. I recommend it strongly. Take some dark Pedro Jimenez sherry and pour it over ice cream. It's just brilliant.
And my wife in the background says vanilla ice cream, correct?
Vanilla ice cream,
Ice cream. Okay.
I claim that's an original discovery.
Well, we have that here, so that maybe that's something we'll do with some of the guests.
It really is good.
We're going to shift gears. Now, when you were speaking about the Scottish Whisky Awards, you received the Scottish Whisky Award. With the intent to honor you, and they did, you stated that you thought Kirsten, the individual who approached you, must be daft for suggesting that you would receive said Scottish Whisky Award. Now, I'm wondering what made you think so, and what changed your mind and made you consider that she was in earnest, and not maybe Jim Swan comes into this conversation a little bit.
Yeah, right. Well, remember, after I left the society
Yep.
in 95, I went off to do other things. And I produced Appreciating Whiskey. And then I produced the Scotch Whisk Directory, I think about 2005. But after I'd done the directory, I thought really I pretty well exhausted my interest in whiskey, and I had a whole lot of other things to go and do. So went and did them. So I more or less forgot about whiskey.
Okay. Okay. You had other things to do.
Mm-hmm. So it was when the society asked me if I'd come back, and I said yes, okay. But I was still fairly semi-detached from the whole thing.
Okay.
And I was then approached by this very nice woman who said they wanted to give me an award. And, nobody had ever given me an award for anything. I thought, why should anybody want to give me an award? I had next to nothing to do with the industry for quite probably 10 or 15 years. And I naturally assumed that I was completely forgotten.
Oh, okay.
No, I mean, it never occurred to me. And there were all sorts of people setting up new distilleries and things, which I viewed with mild interest, but not much. I said, why do you want to give me an award? And I was a bit suspicious, it seemed like a kind of PR scam of some kind. But she was a really nice and intelligent woman. So I said, I don't mind being given an award. What's it about? And then she told me that it was basically a tribute to Jim Swan, who had died a year or two before.
Okay.
Now, I knew Jim Swan well. He was a friend of mine. And Jim was probably the whiskey industry's leading technical expert and the person to whom the distillers frequently turned to solve problems for them.
He's in here as well. He's in your first tasting.
That's Jim there on my right. And that's an early tasting committee.
Yeah, but he's there.
Not the earliest by any means, but an early one. And that's Jim. And Jim used to sit on the tasting committee originally. And he kept us straight as regards all the technicalities and so on. And he was a very good guy, and everybody liked him. And he had a good business. And they had said his family had put up money for these awards. So I said, okay. And I have to say the society was a bit sniffy about it.
Okay.
I'm not sure what was going on at the time. But I had to go to this big swanky do where people sit around dressed in dinner jackets and sit at tables and chat to each other. And then I had to get up on a stage and make a speech. And I decided I'd better write the speech out. And I think I said to you that I let Maggie read it, and she said, "You can't say that," and vetoed most of my speech. So I just.
However, you have the chance right now to put anything back in that speech that you want. Maggie's a lovely individual, but she's on the side.
I can't remember. I can't remember what it was.
Okay.
You just what nonsense and things like that. But the fact is, Jim was a good guy, and I was happy to be associated with him. But a lot of the people there were from much the younger end of the whiskey industry. And I was astonished to find how friendly they were. These guys, none of whom knew me from Adam, were all friendly. and they seem to know quite a lot about what I've done. So, I thought I'd be completely forgotten, and I didn't care. But it appears not. And they gave me a really horrible award. And somebody had made a sort of thing out of bits of whiskey still and bits of cask. And, anything you make out of whiskey stills and cask looks terrible. It's sitting in our kitchen. Maggie won't let me break it up. I was going to break it up and use the bits in my workshop, because bits of copper plate I can use from time to time. But she said, no, I wasn't to. So it's in the kitchen.
Okay. It's funny. And that's the quote right there I had. There was a huge amount of goodwill toward the Scotch Malt Whisky Society in general, and me in particular. I'd been under the impression that our part in the resurgence of Scotch whiskey had been long forgotten. It seems not. Now, you wrote your first edition of the book in part to clear the air and get the history straight, but you also wanted to tell the world about what you did, that something was gained from your time and your effort. So how does it feel to get a tangible thank you from the wider Scotch Malt Whisky Society, and not just in Scotland? So you're getting it there. And then very recently from everybody. And you went to the United States, you went to the 3 cities. I'm wondering how it felt to get the kudos from many different directions, because you got it from one spot there, the SMWS a little bit after that, in bringing you back to do the 35th anniversary, and the pictures with your first bottle, and then the 40th anniversary now, and your book Maverick. How does it feel to get that love coming from many different areas? I've never experienced that, so I'm wondering what it's like.
It's quite pleasant.
I bet.
But nothing more. I mean, it's not the kind of thing that does anything for you.
Okay.
It doesn't do anything for me. I mean, I like the fact that when I go into the Whisky Society, people are nice to me and they give me whiskey.
Yeah.
And that's not a bad thing. And I do occasionally get to go flying around the globe and having people shake my hand and say thank you very much. I mean, that's pleasant, but once you've done it 2 or 3 times, it wears off. Maybe I'm just not egotistical enough, or maybe I'm too egotistical and don't appreciate it. But it was never, it was never part of my plan to be a hero to anyone. Oh, I'm sorry, I've never really thought about this very much.
Okay.
It's very nice. It's very nice to be talking to you guys. It's a pleasure to talk to people who feel as I do about whiskey and things like that. And I have to say that I've had the last few years, I've met an awful lot of really great people, and there are lots of great people both involved in the whiskey industry and as drinkers of it, and it is, I think, making a contribution to the sum total of human happiness, which is one of the reasons why I'm pissed off about people buggering about with bad finishes and stuff like that, and I'm worried that the whole thing may go to ratchet because of such practices. And I think what ought to happen is that the Scottish government ought to step in and ought to legislate so that it limits the practices of the Scotch whisky industry as regards things like finishes and so on. I think there's a strong case to be made for that. And my reason for saying this, let's face it, I'm 83. I'm not gonna last much longer, so it doesn't matter to me. But there are a lot of people in the industry, and a lot of young people setting up distilleries and things to whom it matters a lot. And I would like to see the thing go on for their sake. I would also like to see the thing go on and not be made into a preposterous, consumerist hype, as seems to be happening in some quarters, for reasons of national prestige. I am, after all, a Scotsman, and I care about how people view Scotland. And the reason I wrote all that stuff about kilts and tartans is that it's mostly a heap of shit, and I want people to know about it. But I also want them to know about the real thing, the real kilts, the real tartans, the real whiskey. Because I suppose my self-esteem is to some extent bound up with a lot of that stuff, and my conception of myself. And I mean, if I were a Norwegian or a Frenchman or an Irishman, I would feel exactly the same sort of thing about my country. It's not a particularly nationalistic thing. It's a thing about human communities. I'm sorry, I'm becoming fake. Blame the whiskey.
Blame the whiskey.
But it's something we all have in common. And I don't want Scotch whiskey to go to rat shit for the sake of guys like you who really enjoy it, and so that you can continue to get it. And me too.
Well, that, Pip, is going to be the last sentence. That's perfect. That's the perfect way to end what we're doing today. So I'm going to focus on all of us here for a second, and Rob, and then Gregory. I'm going to ask you if you have any last comments or questions that you'd like to include into the conversation before we sign off, because we've been on for almost 2.5 hours, Pip, and
we really.
You know what? The time flies. It always does with you. But I feel bad as I hear you cough. I think I'm pushing you a little bit too hard with all our questions. So we're going to wrap it up. But Rob, you're the perfect person to come after that. Just starting, you came out with your first bottle, your first expression right there, and I'm pretty happy with it. So what do you have to say there, Rob?
I don't have any other questions. I mean, it's always interesting listening to Pip and, the history and his views, a lot of which echo mine. I probably, this might be a little out of turn, but I agree with him in terms of finishes. It seems to be a point of innovation now, which it shouldn't be. It should be about great whiskey. And I think the society is doing too much of it, to be frank. And just about everything has been played with in some way, shape, or form, which I think goes too far from the original ethos of single cask, single malt. We've made our views known, but we're just a little tiny part of all of this. So, but I, thank you, Pip. Thank you, Dolph, for putting this together, and thanks, Greg, for your contributions, and it's been a pleasure.
And thank you for coming on, sir. Gregory.
Well, I'd just like to say that in a world where they market form, it's nice to be able to talk to people who actually appreciate substance.
Oh, nice.
Thank you. That's good.
I like that. That's a perfect way. Well, that's all the time we have tonight. This afternoon, finally, tonight for Pip Whiskey Friends. It's been a fantastic morning and afternoon for me, evening hopefully for Pip. Thanks to our listeners. Thanks to the panel. Gregory, Rob, Pip, it's been an absolute pleasure spending this time with y'all. And I hope you had as much time as I did. I know I think...
Well, thank you. Thank you for bringing it together. Dolph, it's been a pleasure.
I will do this anytime you want to, Pip. And let's wrap it. Join us in 3 weeks, Saturday, February 3rd, for part 2 of the Whisky Book Club's. What book are we doing? We're doing part 2. That's it. Part 2 of our 23rd book. And here, I'll even join that up right there. Boom. There's the information you need. And so it's our 23rd book, Whiskey, everything you need to know about whiskey, but we're too afraid to ask, with Nicholas Morgan. This is the second time we've done it. And Nicholas is a lovely individual as well. And as a final note...
Pay me a visit next month.
Oh, perfect. And he's going to be there with you, you said? Sorry?
Yeah. He and John McChaney, our brand ambassador, they're coming up to Montrose for lunch.
Excellent. Well, I wish I was running in the same circles. I talk to the same people, but I wish I was actually face to face like you are with them. If you want to see us online, click like, subscribe, all that. But raise a glass there, gentlemen. As always, here's the good company.
Here's to you.
Here's the good whiskey. Here's the good books. And there's so many of them out there from Pip. You can get a massive amount, but get the last.
Right. Thanks again, Dolph. A pleasure.
Here's a good conversation. Thank you all. Cheers. Sláinte. I hope you all have a fantastic day. And I hope to see you all again very soon. Cheers, y'all.
Cheers.